Good morning, everybody. How are we all doing today? Hope everybody's okay out there. Had a little bit of a stressful start today. My modem at my house seems to have died. So I'm running off of my Wi-Fi router right now. So I apologize if there's any little technical glitches. Ellen is also kind of hanging out in the background just in case my connection drops. She will take over or anything like that. So apologize for that. But let's get started. I hope everybody's out there having a wonderful Saturday out there and everything. I want to start by saying thank you again to everyone that's been donating to help Ocean Stories stay online. We made a decision yesterday that any extra funds we raise beyond what's needed to keep Ocean Stories running was going to be donated to Heart for Cabo. Heart for Cabo is running an incredible program right now that's creating like these food baskets for the local community, for people that are in poverty or out of work due to tourism being shut down and all that kind of stuff. It's a really incredible initiative. Basically, every $100 we donate brings a week's worth of food and necessary supplies to families, to 10 families. So $100 feeds 10 families that currently really have nothing. It's really beautiful what their team has been doing, and although Ocean Stories and Dive Ninjas could really use the extra money, we would rather donate the extra to them to kind of help feed our local community. So we'll be posting some more updates about that soon. And on a brighter note, yesterday I received an email that really just brought a smile to my face and our whole team's face. One of our viewers is a super passionate 10-year-old shark lover and budding conservationist. His mom sent us over a recording of a presentation he made for school about shark finning, and it's incredible. So I just want to take a second to say, Ronan, if you're tuning in today, thank you for the awesome presentation and for reminding me why we do what we do. We need more young ocean heroes like you in the world, so keep up the great work, Ninja. I've spoken also to shark scientist Marta from the other day's Secret Life of Sharks talk, and I'm going to be sending an email to your mom to kind of link you guys up in Costa Rica and all that stuff. So super, super cool stuff. Next up, speaking of sharks, we've got some awesome shark talks coming up in 2 weeks on Ocean Stories. Plus, I'm going to be teaching a special Project Aware shark conservation course online for Dive Ninjas on May 9th. But first, this coming week, we're taking a trip into the macro world to kind of look and explore these tiny little mind-blowing creatures that call our oceans home. We've got some awesome talks on blackwater diving, nudibranchs, even macro photography. But we can't start looking at the smallest critters without first looking at the largest fish in our oceans. So hopefully everybody is ready for some whale sharks today. Gonzo, how are you doing today, man?
Very well, Jay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. So Gonzo is the director of the Large Marine Vertebrate Research Institute in the Philippines. They do some really incredible work on all different species, not just whale sharks. Lots of really incredible work out there. Dive Ninjas is going to be going out there next January for a very special kind of citizen science style trip with Gonzo and the team at Lamabe aboard the Philippine Siren. So if you want to get up close to these incredible animals and learn firsthand about the great work being done by Lamabe and the rest of the whole team out there, I definitely recommend checking it out with us. I can post a link in the chat in case anyone's interested or anything like that. But let me kick it over to you, Gonzo. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and without further ado, let you rock and roll.
1 second. Sorry, I lost my mouse. There we go. 1 sec. That working for everyone?
Perfect. We got it. Awesome, man.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jay. Good morning, good evening, everyone. Glad you could join us. My name is Gonzalo. I've been working with shark research and conservation in the Philippines for almost 9 years. And I've been studying whale sharks for about 8 years or so. So tonight I wanted to talk to you a little bit about whale sharks and some of the work we do, some of the science behind the conservation that's been driven on a local and on a global scale. So without further ado, let me introduce you to the world's largest fish. There we go. So this is from the IUCN. The species was uplisted to endangered in a global review that happened leading up to 2016. Essentially, there's been massive population declines of over 50% in the last 3 generations that led to the uplisting of the species in the Indo-Pacific. with a subpopulation in the Atlantic that is listed as vulnerable. The species is globally distributed. So as you can see on this map, they can travel as far north as the Azores in Portugal, as far south as San Helena Island in the Atlantic. In the Indian Ocean, we find them in South Africa, all the way up to the Arabian Peninsula and the Red Sea. And in the Pacific, we find them all around as well. So what we're trying to understand now on a global scale is how are these fish still endangered and where are these threats coming from? So what we do know, because there's a lot of stuff we still don't know about this species, it is the world's largest fish. They can grow to about 20 meters with multiple studies concluding around the 20-meter mark, different approaches as well. They are in tropical and warm temperate waters. So like I was saying, like pretty much most of our oceans, they grow very slowly and mature late. So these animals grow at the peak of growth, maybe about half a meter a year. That is nothing for an animal that grows to about 20 meters. And what's interesting is they seem to grow rather quickly to about, say, 4 to 6 meters, and then they slow their growth rate. So it's funny, like when we chat to some scientists that have been looking at the same individual whale sharks over decadal, so over like decades of work with these animals, and they can barely tell they've been growing. So now we're trying to perfect some of the methods we use to measure these whale sharks. Conventionally, we use, say, a rope, and we swim next to the animal to try and get an estimate of size. We can also use 2 lasers, for example, that are propelled and projected on the body of the animal, and from that measurement, we extrapolate the whole size of the animal. But these methods still carry a degree of error, so about half a meter, say. Then on a 5-meter animal, it's still 10% of the animal, so it's still quite a lot. So if you want to get accurate measurements and therefore estimate accurately how big they are when they start to reproduce, how big they are when they're born and so on, we need better methods. And a method that's kicking off really nicely with open access kind of approaches, so it's cheaper and more people can access it, is using 2 video cameras essentially. And this creates a 3-dimensional kind of whale shark in your computer, and you can then extrapolate size from it, and it's pretty accurate, down to like 2 to 3% error. So they grow slowly, they're very big. We have identified around 25 global hotspots where these animals come together at certain times of the year, and most of these sites are associated with food. So primary productivity, we find a lot of plankton, fish spawning, or aggregations of small fishes, for example. And whale sharks have something unique that is quite interesting. Their spot pattern on their bodies is like your fingerprint. So if we take a photo of these spots, we can actually tell each whale shark apart. And luckily, most scientists globally are using an online platform that is open for everyone called Wild Book for Whale Sharks at whaleshark.org. And to date, we have over 10,000 individual whale sharks, which is rather incredible. And a lot of these animals have come from the general public. So through citizen science, people engaging in when they see a whale shark, try and get the right photograph and then share it through this platform. And then a scientist working in that area can actually match it to a population there, or did this whale shark come from somewhere else, which is even more interesting. Whale sharks are incredible because when we do find them, they tend to be at the surface, but doesn't mean they spend a lot of time there. They do, but not all the time. They can dive very deeply. For example, the deepest recorded depth is just over 1,900 meters, so that's pretty deep. And the only reason we don't have deeper recordings is because the tags crashed. This is common for some of the large females they see in the Galapagos. These are like 12, 14, 15-meter whale sharks, and they have been putting out these tags and they just keep crashing out. So the guys at the Georgia Aquarium with some special engineers from Monterey have designed a new tag that will hopefully show us how deep these animals can really go, which is really cool. So the whale shark is one of 3 filter feeding species, together with the basking shark that we find in like higher latitudes, and the megamouth shark, which we also find in kind of tropic and warm temperate waters as well. Like I was saying, these whale sharks form predictable aggregations, and that's when we design studies. So we know a lot of whale sharks are going to be in certain location for an extended amount of time. This is allows scientists like us to target some of these places and understand what's going on there, and also try and link those threats. If they're spending a lot of time in specific areas, can we focus our conservation efforts there, for example? And these guys are very good at finding food. So that's one of their primary drivers, particularly when they're juveniles, which is the majority of the whale sharks we see globally. They tend to be associated with food. And some tagging studies have shown how far and why they can move. And a lot of the time is linked to some of those productivity locations. So it's really, really interesting. So what we know is that, for example, they have a pretty small brain. So a small, say a 5-meter whale shark has, the brain is probably the size of my fist. So it's pretty small for the world's largest fish, not the cleverest. But the part of the brain that's developed is actually the cerebellum. And the cerebellum in sharks have been linked to behavior, modification and adaptation, and location facilitation. So if you think of a whale shark that is a filter feeder, so preys on the smallest kind of animals in the sea, they have to be able to find food in these like really patchy and very productive parts of the ocean. So really interesting stuff. So how we tell them male from female, the males you can see on this photo, they have claspers that come from the inside of the pelvic fins. The ones on the right are mature, so they become longer than the pelvic fins and they become calcified, and they have this kind of cauliflower ending at the end. And we think this is used to clasp into the female when they're mating. However, nobody has ever documented whale sharks mating globally. So this is one of those still mysteries to find. Whereas the female lacks the claspers, of course. What we know of whale shark reproduction actually comes from one single female that was landed in '95 in Taiwan. And she was carrying 300 pups inside her. How incredible is that? And this female was about 10.5 meters or so. If you think of some of the females they see off the islands in Baja California or in the Galapagos that are 12, 14, 50 meters, how many pups might they be carrying? Really interesting. So this is quite cool. So the top 2 photos is of 2 little whale sharks, 2 neonates that were found in 2009 near Don Sol, which is one of the oldest whale shark tourism sites in the world. This is in the island of Luzon in the Philippines. And about a month ago, our team was there on duty and they found another neonate, which is truly remarkable because these occurrences are very, very rare. So our team is currently working on a small publication to look a little bit more into why this is going on there, which is pretty cool. And why does this matter? Because whale sharks still face quite a lot of threats. So these photos are from a report from Wildlife Risk, published in 2014. These guys went incognito into some fish processing factories in the south of China, actually Southeast China. And they, from their estimates, they were processing in this one factory between 600 and 1,000 5-meter whale sharks. So this is figures we extrapolated based on the size of the liver, on the weight of the liver, on the amount of oil you can extract from a single whale shark. So we're looking at, say, hundreds of whale sharks every year from a single processing factory is rather staggering. So some of this information went into the IUCN uplisting in 2016 because we didn't know the scale of the take of whale sharks. And some of the threats they still face today, for example, they get entangled in nets and they drown because they still need to move to breathe. They can suction in water and therefore breathe through their gills. But if their mouth is shut, which we have seen in the Philippines, unfortunately, they drown. And when this happens, obviously the locals will take the opportunity to consume that meat. The unfortunate thing is we have no way of telling what's the scale of this. And this is one of those things we need to pay a little bit more attention because we think it might not be happening, but maybe it is happening offshore where you could dispose of the body, for example. You could only keep the liver perhaps, and nobody would ever find out. Some of the more interesting or more relevant threats that we can have a big impact on is vessel collisions. You can see this photo here on the top left. This is from a paper published in 1940, which is amazing. And Gadger documented a bunch of whale sharks that were being stuck on the bows of boats. And he was documented this on arrival at ports. And what we see today is what the photos more on the right of the screen and on the bottom left. This is some of the whale sharks we encounter regularly, and some of the propeller strikes are quite substantial. And we have observed a lot of amputations, so a lot of fins cut off, dorsal fin cut off, part of the tail cut off, and we haven't really found a way of accurately quantifying the energetic cost that this might have on the animal. There are a few papers now published on the survivability of these whale sharks. I know the guys in the Maldives are working on a couple of papers on this. Ningaloo has also published a couple of papers, somewhere in the Western Indian Ocean as well. So it is interesting, and it doesn't seem to be impacting survivability that high. But what we have to know is that when a whale shark dies, it sinks to the bottom. So the more major ship strikes, for example, we're not seeing them, we're not quantifying them. So we don't actually know how many sharks are actually dying from direct visual collision, leading to mortality. Another issue that's become apparent is plastic, for example. These guys filter feed. Clearly, they're like vacuum in the water column. So more pollution, more stuff in the water will likely create blockages. Could this lead to a loss of energy consumption, a loss of health, a loss of impacts on their physiology? And this is just in the early stages, and we're starting to look at it across most of their sites globally. Microplastics in the water as well, and so on. So this is ongoing at the moment. I'm going to tell you a little bit more detail about the whale sharks of the Philippines, because it's where I spend most of my time working with the species over the past 8 years. And the Philippines is an interesting place because they had targeted whale shark hunting into the 90s, and they were taking up to 100 whale sharks per season, the season being from November to about May, when the weather is more amenable. They were hunting this many in the Central Islands, between the villages of Pamilacan, Camiguin, and Talisayan, which you can see there on the screen. And what happened was quite interesting. Was in 1997, they first reported there's a lot of whale sharks occurring in Donsol in the north. And the president at the time was an avid scuba diver. So conservationists that have been working in the country had prepped a law to protect the species. And in 1998, actually what happened was some of the hunters from the Central Islands traveled north and took opportunity that all of these whale sharks were close to shore in Donsol, and actually caught, I think it's 6 or 7, the literature is gray there. And this led to a big media outcry. The locals were furious. This went on the news globally. And this led to the president passing a law overnight protecting the whale shark. And although this was amazing, what obviously wasn't in place was, okay, how do we communicate this to the villages that depended on the hunting? This was a way of life. This was a livelihood. So some places like Pamilacan, for example, they turned their boats into kind of dolphin watching activities. So they've actually benefited from some of these tourism opportunities that came up. But over the years, we actually worked in Talisayan in North Mindanao, and there the villagers were left alone. Essentially, they took their livelihood away. There was nothing given to them. So there's a little resentment there of what happened. And we did some socioeconomic surveys there in 2017. And if they were allowed to, they would go back to hunting any day, because for them, it was a source of pride. It was a source of who they were, their identity. So when you're thinking of conservation of a species, you have to weigh in some of these factors, because it's not just the animals, it's not just the ocean, it's the people that brings it all together for the good, for the bad, and for the management, sustainable management of the species. Since then, there was no population level data on whale sharks in the Philippines. So all we knew was they were taking them in the hundreds in the 90s. What happened then? We don't know. So in 2012, we started studying the whale sharks across multiple sites. And we started with local ecological knowledge. I mean, who knows more about whale sharks than the fishermen that are going out every day catching fish, and they see these spotted giants traveling around. So we started there. And hijacking this uniqueness of whale sharks, that they have this unique spot pattern, we can actually start quantifying how many there are. Are they spending a lot of time in a specific area? Are they linking to other sites where we've been monitoring the sharks as well? So through this technique called photo identification, or photo ID for short, we can actually learn a lot about populations of whale sharks. So what we do is we take a photo, which is a capture of an individual animal, and then every time we go out, we also photograph them again, or we photograph them in other sites. In the Philippines, were over 1,900 whale sharks identified this way, across 5 major hotspots, which I'll share with you in a second. And we have documented using this fingerprint movements between Taiwan and the Philippines and Indonesia, the Philippines and Malaysia, and vice versa as well. So it's a very powerful tool. And it's also because whale sharks swim near the surface, they don't have big teeth, and people love swimming with them. We can actually enlist the general public as citizen scientists to help us collect some of this data. And this has been pivotal in our work. So we've been very, very lucky that we've had amazing people willing to contribute and help. So if you guys are out there and you're swimming with a whale shark, make sure you take the photo like you're seeing on the screen. And this is just an example. We have 4 whale sharks here. You can kind of tell them apart. You build your eye over time. But what you do is, we're lucky that some very clever people developed an algorithm for mapping the stars. And these guys actually took that algorithm and applied it to the body of the whale shark, because it's literally just like the sky, right, with a bunch of spots. So we can now automate the way we ID the animals and the way we process data a lot faster. It also helps with this global database, whale shark, it wasn't on that one, whaleshark.org, that if everyone's putting in these photos and we're using this automated software, we can actually accelerate the amount of information we're processing, the amount of information we're gathering, and the amount of knowledge we have about where whale sharks are spending a lot of time or moving to and from. So when you design management interventions, you have a little bit more insight. Essentially, if you know they're using a specific area and you want to avoid vessel collisions, maybe you just focus your efforts in that area. These are the 5 hotspots where we have, and we monitor whale sharks seasonally or year round. So we have Don Sol in the island of Luzon to the north, and we have Pintuyan and Oslov in the Bohol Sea. And we have 2 sites in the Sulu Sea, Honda Bay and Tubataha Reefs. Tubataha Reefs is a diving destination. It's 2 atolls and a small exposed reef in the middle of the Sulu Sea. Very hard to access. The weather is kind of good between March and June, July. So what we get is a snippet of time when tourists go there during the season, and they actually collect photo ID for us. And when we run our expeditions, we also collect information on those whale sharks. So just passing on through that. So citizen science is a powerful tool, like I was saying. So please submit your photos of whale sharks on whaleshark.org, because it will help a scientist somewhere in the world for sure. So what we've learned is through photo ID, we actually match movement of whale sharks all over the Philippines. And this has been amazing to support some of our other work. So, which I'll tell you more in a second, is we're using different tools. Citizen science and photo ID is one of them that can help complement those other tools, like telemetry. So there's a lot of tags we can use on whale sharks. Starting from the left, those 2, the small one and the big one, they're pop-up archival tags. So these tags collect data over time, and at a preset date, they pop to the surface and transmit that data through the satellite. The other 2, you have to drill them through the dorsal fin, which we don't use on whale sharks, but they have been used in Indonesia, for example, and in the Gulf of Mexico, and they've had some incredible retention. They have some tracks spanning over 10,000 kilometers. So Rafa de la Parra, working in the Gulf of Mexico, was showing me some tracks of these whale sharks moving all the way into the central Atlantic and coming back to the Gulf of Mexico, just off the Yucatan Peninsula, and incredible. And the tags you see on the right here, these are acoustic tags that on some species of shark, you can put them internally, and in whale sharks, we tend to use them externally. Although I know some guys in Indonesia are putting them internally and have had good retention. So in this photo, what we have is a toad spot tag. So these tags are really clever, actually. When it is exposed to air at the surface, it turns the tag on and starts transmitting messages. And the Argos satellite system will pick up these messages and estimate the location of the shark. The more messages and transmissions it gets, the more accurate that location of the animal. And using these tags, we actually saw in a lot of detail how whale sharks were using some of the areas where we work with the species, and we also identify new hotspots for the animals. So this is some of the tools you can use to understand these animals. For example, northern Mindanao, we knew there was a lot of whale sharks there, a lot of reports from the fishermen, but we couldn't find them. And when we tagged them, we were like, oh, actually, they're highly associated with coastal areas and these big zooplankton blooms that happen at specific times of the year. So that was truly amazing. These other tags are pop-up tags, like I was saying, and this one helped us identify connectivity between Western Philippines, the island of Palawan, and Borneo, so Sabah, Malaysia. So again, this presents a new management challenge. It's fine to manage whale sharks in the Philippines, where tourism is huge with the species, supports multiple endeavors across different sites. Everyone's aware the species is federally protected. What goes on in Malaysia? What goes on in Indonesia? And these animals have to go back and forth. And the southern Sulu Sea is notorious for illegal activity. So if any of these animals are being caught there, we would have no idea. So from a management and a conservation point of view, that's where the efforts need to be, at least in this group of animals. Other tags we can use, this is an example of a temperature depth recorder tag. These tags are tiny. Think of an A4 battery, a little bit shorter. And what these tags do is collect a lot of information, and they're very cheap and very small, so the attachment would therefore be less invasive on the animal. And we've used these ones in one of the sites where the whale sharks are fed, which is quite a controversial subject, which we'll leave for another time. But what we were seeing was that the whale sharks, when they were being fed, they were spending all their time at the surface, so this is warmer waters, and at the end of each of those, they were spending time at a deeper, cooler water. So could this have something to do with their metabolism, something to do with their satiation? So if they were being fed a lot of food, maybe they need to like cool down their metabolism. So we have this paper under review. Hopefully we can share with you guys soon. Another tag we've been trying out is an accelerometer tag with our friends at Flinders University in Australia. These tags are essentially, think of your iPhone, it's about that size. We stick them to the side of the animal on the dorsal fin, and this records the three-dimensional axis movement of the shark. And as cool as it sounds, this is what it looks like. So it's not that easy to interpret what you're seeing. But what you do see is those tail beats. You see when the animals are moving faster, when they're moving slower, and we can actually get estimations of energy use based on those. So if we have, for example, whale sharks feeding on a thick concentration of zooplankton, are they very efficient at energy use, or are they actually crap at it? For example, in one of our sites in Western Philippines, the whale sharks there feed on fish. They chase small fish, small bait fish. And they use tuna, or the tuna rather use the whale sharks, we don't know, to bring this bait ball into a very, very tight ball. And that's when the whale shark comes in and actually feeds on a lot of these fish. But how much energy are they using? Is it more efficient than feeding on zooplankton? That is the contrasting season in the region. So this is some of the questions we're trying to answer. We can also use molecular techniques. For example, if we collect a small tissue sample of the animal, we can actually try and understand where do they piece together from other populations around the world. So our friend Alex Watts from Manchester Metropolitan University, working with Marine Megafauna Foundation, she's actually putting together a global study on whale sharks to understand how populations are linked together. And one of the coolest preliminary results she has is that the population in the Gulf of Mexico is actually closer to the population in Baja California, which is something we would not expect. It's closer to that one than the San Helena population, which is in the South Atlantic. So how did this happen? Well, apparently about 10,000 years ago, Mexico was connected east to west through water. So they were underwater. So it is possible that the population of whale sharks was actually separated back then. So this is some of the questions that I'm hoping Alex will help us answer over the next year or two. Another thing we can do is actually look at the microbes that live on the skin of the whale sharks. And this can give us an idea of their health, for example, where they're hanging out. If they have a microbiome that is made up of microbes that actually are associated with cooler waters, for example, or waters with a certain level of minerals in the water, for example. So this can actually help us piece together where these animals might be coming from, where they might be going to, which is kind of cool. And there's also like hundreds of thousands of microbes living on like a tiny amount of skin of a whale shark. So that's interesting on its own idea. We can also look at what they're feeding and what kind of quantities they're feeding on. So this again can help us. Can we predict where these blooms of zooplankton or specific prey that they're targeting might be occurring, and therefore help managers, or for example, in an area where tourism is important for the management of the species, can we help them divert when the tourism and when the season is going to happen, so that management intervention is better executed. And from that, we can, for example, learn what they're feeding on, how much they're feeding on, if there's microplastics in the water. So we have a study at the moment going on in the Bohol Sea, looking at microplastics in the water in areas where whale sharks aggregate. So hopefully we'll have some results soon to share, because that'd be really interesting. It's one of those things that is kind of in the back and is happening, and we don't really know what the impact is on some of these megafauna species, particularly the filter feeders. And tourism plays a key role in whale shark conservation and their management. So we have 20 to 30 global sites dedicated to whale shark tourism. So we have, like, in Baja California, there's 2, there's Bahía de Los Ángeles, Bahía de La Paz, for example. In the east, we have the Afuera aggregation. We have aggregations of whale sharks in the Red Sea, in Saudi Arabia. We have whale sharks in Qatar. And Qatar, for example, is thinking of moving into tourism. Could this be feasible? It's one of the busiest regions for vessels in the world. Could adding value to the whale shark help us create exclusion zones where we know these whale sharks aggregate for the big shipping vessels, like the oil transporters and the container transporters as well pass through there. So these are some of the things that, if we had that information, if we had that knowledge, it could help us put conservation plans into action. Tourism can also be a threat. So tourism is normally treated as like the best alternative to, like, fishing an animal, but it's not necessarily the answer. Tourism is one possible answer. It can have consequences on individual animals and the population, or part of the population as well. So when you're thinking of what is the best approach, you have to rule out all your options of, can we leave these animals alone? Yes, no, what is the implications here? And we know of many sites globally where tourism has become a problem. And people taking a photo in the water or taking a selfie with a whale shark think they're saving the whale shark when they might actually be causing more damage than they're realizing. So when we think of tourism, we have to understand the implications of us being there, implications of us being in the water, possibly disturbing critical behavior for the animals. And this needs to be considered when you're designing management plans. We started to use drones actually to monitor some of the whale shark tourism, and it's super cool. Some of the imagery is amazing. You can see these photos in Donsol. Waters are very green, very productive, and whale sharks tend to be huge there. But for some reason, we captured this rather small animal swimming with a bunch of tourists. We're also using the drones to measure the sharks. It's not very accurate. We haven't perfected it yet, but we're getting there. So hopefully we'll have, well, COVID kind of ruined this year's season there, but hopefully by the end of next year's season, we'll have some good estimates of size. And tourism can also play an important role in community development. These photos are from Southern Leyte, from a place called Sonok. It's a small village. The village of Sonok makes on average an extra 50% than surrounding coastal fishing villages. And a lot of that is associated with the whale shark tourism. It's not just the whale sharks. We actually had a program with the women in the community. They hand sew these like whale shark fluffies. And they actually, on good seasons, they make more than the men. So again, this is interesting because it's also changing the home economics in a way. So it's very, very, very interesting. So I just wanted to leave this photo with you there. When you think of whale sharks and interacting with them, try and keep some sort of guidelines. There are guidelines normally for all their whale shark aggregations globally. In some places they're low, so they're punishable, or you can get fined if you break them. In other places, it's the best recommended guidelines. But think of, what impact am I having? What impact am I having when I'm swimming with these animals? Particularly boat proximity, for example, that's a huge issue. So just be responsible. I know most of you are, so I'm not going to lecture you on that, but just bear in mind that we are guests in that natural environment, and when we're in there, we're lucky to be there, and we should respect those inhabitants there. So yeah, I mean, trying to bring all this information together, not just the tourism and the tagging and the photo ID and the citizen science, it all needs to lead somewhere. And this is a crucial part of the work that we do. We work closely with communities, with local governments, with national governments, and in some cases, like on an international scale, because there are treaties and there's agreements to help some of the migratory species. And it is key that they have the best available science when they're trying to make decisions. And that's one of the roles we are trying to fulfill in the Philippines, in Malaysia, with some of our neighboring partners and international partners as well. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for listening. And I think we have time for some questions, Jay.
Yeah, thank you very much, man. That was an incredible presentation. Thank you so much for teaching us all about whale sharks today. We definitely got some time for questions. So guys, if you want to put in some questions in the Q&A box below, we can start reading them out. We've already got a few of them coming in. So let me pop this open. So first question comes from Carrie. She says, fantastic talk. I've been taking screenshots of your charts to study later. When I was diving in Roatan, the disaster said whale sharks appear there seasonally to feed on coral spawn. Hopefully someone is studying this phenomenon in this area. I guess not a question, but are you guys studying anything with the whale sharks feeding on coral spawn?
They have been documented feeding on coral spawn, for example, in Ningaloo Reef in Western Australia. They can feed on that, a very good opportunistic predator. So whatever might be available, even if they're in the region, in the general area to feed on something else, they will make the most of a preying opportunity that is, is good food. If it's cheap, good food, they will go for it.
All right. So Jorge asks, which natural predator could pursue a whale shark?
That's a very good question. So whale sharks have been documented on the stomach of some species, for example, marlins. We have seen whale sharks with giant scars that look like other species of predatory shark, like a great white or a tiger shark, for example. This is more common off the coast of Africa, southeastern Africa, in Western Australia as well. Natural predators, when they're bigger, they have observed orca targeting whale sharks, flipping them over and just eating the liver of the whale shark. So again, the way orca groups work is a lot of the time they have unique, how would you say? They have their unique culture, and a lot of that is specific behaviors as well. So it could be specific groups of orca that have learned to target whale sharks and make the most of that. But so yeah, those are some of the predators.
Really interesting. Really interesting that some of them were able to figure that out. You know, it's mind-blowing how intelligent of an animal they are. So Kerry asks, have you been able to study associations among individuals? And if so, what were your techniques, or is there any publications on it?
So whale sharks are generally solitary animals. There is we did some social networking analysis. This would be using a microcapture approach. And we find associations between specific individual animals. But what tends to happen is that these are the resident whale sharks to a specific area. And we know they might be residing there for, say, 2, 3, 4 months, because we actually see them on survey every day or every few days. So, and when you remove those from your data set, there's no further associations in those. But maybe if you drop me a private message, I'd be happy to share some of the stuff that's out there.
Awesome, sounds great. We can shoot you Carrie's email afterwards and anything like that. Awesome. So Vinny asks, how do scuba divers affect whale sharks, and why is it prohibited in their vicinity?
Good question. So normally what we tend to do when you're trying to manage a species that you don't necessarily fully understand, right? And you know it's endangered, there's all these threats they have and so on. We take what is called the precautionary principle. There are certain things that you couldn't possibly measure. But for whale sharks, for proximity, we know, for example, there's at least 2 publications that show that proximity of motorized vessels, the closer they get, the shorter the whale shark will stick around. Either they dive deep, or they like bugger off, or they speed up, for example. With scuba gear specifically, it's actually, from what I've observed, over the years is a bit down to the individual level. So in certain areas where there's a lot of food in the water, and that's why the whale sharks would be in that area naturally, the breaking of the bubbles would simulate some of the spawning krill they like to feed on. So the whale shark would actually detect these vibrations and might actually come and try and feed on your bubbles. So it's understanding some of these relationships. So keeping a distance is essentially just to make the diver safe and to keep the whale shark safe. Because if you think of a large whale shark, if it were to slap you with the tail, which I have unfortunately, is not fun, because it's like as hard as a wall and the skin is like sandpaper. And I've seen some people actually get smacked and the whole skin got ripped off. So it is for animal and human safety as well.
Perfect. Stuwe asks, I learned earlier this week that basking sharks are often observed breaching. Do we know if whale sharks ever breach? And also, do whale sharks have teeth?
Two very good questions. So whale sharks have never been documented to breach. Basking sharks do breach, but never seen on whale sharks. And they do have teeth. They have 2,000 to 3,000 very, very small teeth. And what we think this is designed to is when the whale shark feeds with its mouth open on a big patch of zooplankton, is to trap some of that plankton that is being stuck in the mouth. And then they can gulp it down into the esophagus. So that is a very good question.
Awesome. So Chloe asks, does Lamave come up against resistance from locals in regards to tagging whale sharks?
Good question. There have been, say, some friction in the past because some of the tagging tended to coincide with the end of the season. So you'd put on a bunch of tags, or you'd try to get some skin samples, and the sharks would disappear the following week, and they would try and link it to the tagging. But normally what we do is we would approach the stakeholders before we do anything and make sure that they know what we're going to do and try and do it quickly so as not to have somebody there disturbing all the time through the season. We don't normally do any of the activities with tourists because we don't want to encourage potentially people trying to randomly stab a whale shark with a spear ball. But no, not resistance. If we've done the meetings with all the stakeholders in the right way and presented why we needed to put tags or take a skin tissue of the animal, we haven't had major issues.
Awesome. Adil asks, what's one of the best experiences you've ever had with a whale shark?
That's a very good question. When in 2016, when we were tagging whale sharks in North Mindanao, nobody had done whale shark work there ever. So it was very exciting. And when we jumped in, it was just me and my colleague, and we were deploying sat tags. And we had this 6.5 meter whale shark swimming with us in a circle for like 30 minutes. And we were like, that whale shark looked very familiar. And later on, when we checked the IDs, we actually realized that it's one of our seasonal residents at one of the other sites. So we were like, good old friends in a new site. So it was kind of it was a cute story.
Awesome, that's really good. Super cool. So Mads asks, she says, hey Gonzo, great to see you again. Thanks for the great talk. Could you add some more details on the newly found neonate, how it was found, what depth, etc.? And do you see many large females in that area?
Thank you, Matt, for the question. Yes, we do. So Don Sol is one of the few sites in the world where actually we see a good number of recurring adults in the area, including females. So the neonate, what happened was, it was around, I want to say 6:30 a.m. or so, and somebody saw the whale shark from shore, like about, say, 10 meters into the water. And the first thing they did was tell because it was next to the tourism office. So the tourism officer called our project leader on site, and they were like, hey, there's a whale shark here. And in the meantime, they actually grabbed the whale shark because they were like, well, maybe these guys want to do something with it. We didn't, we would have just left it alone, but that's what happened. And they put it in a small basket in the water, like they were holding it underwater, which is good. And they took some measurements, we took some of the photo ID, and what happened then is like we moved it into deeper water so it wouldn't be disturbed again, because if we had left it in the shallow waters near shore, somebody else might have caught it. or it could have accidentally get caught on a coastal gillnet, for example. So yeah, it's pretty cool because they found 2 neonates like just over a decade ago in the general vicinity, and we do see large females. So it is showing like Don Solo, that specific area, might be really important, not just for adults, but also for neonates. Maybe it's a pupping ground. And these are some of those sites that we actually still have no idea where they are. So it's a very, very good first start.
Oh, that's amazing. That would be incredible to see where it goes and everything. Unbelievable. It's like a dream to see one that small. Awesome. So Christina says, congratulations, guys, and thank you for the presentation. How many individuals have you tagged so far?
So using the photo ID, so visually tagging them, if you will, we are at 1,950 something in the Philippines, and it's just over 10,000 globally. And with satellite tags, we've deployed 17 spots between 2015 and 16. We deployed 10 mini pads, so the pop-up tags in 2018. And we did some of the other types of tags between 2014 and September last year. So I'd say about 50 whale sharks overall tagged with different types of tags.
Nice, amazing. Awesome. Abdullah asks, how did the fishermen in Mindanao sustain themselves after the 1998 ban came in?
It's a good question. They didn't, essentially. They had to shift livelihood to whatever was available. So if you visit the area today, it's actually the municipality is quite prosperous, but with the village where the original whale shark hunters were, and some of them still are, is actually the poorest of the villages in the area. And what we think happened, and also talking to them, is just there was this fake feeling of, hey, help is coming tomorrow. Some government, some NGO is going to come in and help you out. And that kind of never happened. And in the process, they were just like, well, what do we do now? So they just went out and found other ways of fishing or maintaining the family.
Really interesting. Really interesting. So Faye asks, she says, thanks for the great talk. What is the best advice for trying to keep distance when a whale shark swims straight at you and you can't swim as fast as them to get out of the way?
Yeah, it's a good question. Sometimes I do follow you. Yeah, I mean, what we normally advise is, because the guidelines globally are normally, say, 3 meters from the body and 4 meters from the tail. So that would be, say, your body length with your fins and a little more, or maybe you extending your arm. That'd be kind of the distance you want to be keeping. If they come straight at you, what you can do is swim to the side of them, because they're not very good at turning. So think of, there's some very good footage on YouTube, for example, of tiger sharks feeding on sea turtles. And you see that what the sea turtles do is essentially swim over the back of the tiger shark, because sharks cannot turn that fast, and that they don't have that agility to turn so fast and so tightly. So normally if they are coming straight at you, the best thing to do is just swim quickly to one side of the animal and then swim kind of away from it. That's what we do.
Awesome. I have this picture in my head now of a whale shark trying to turn like 90 degrees really fast. Awesome. So Anonymous writes, for someone who wants to learn more about these marine animals, which is the best way to learn more?
Very good point. So we have our new website is launching this coming week, and we're going to have a resource center, and it's going to have detailed information about all the species we work with. Obviously, the whale shark is one of them. We also have a pretty neat infographic on there about whale sharks, their distribution, their threats, their numbers. That's also, you can download it as a PDF, and it has quite a lot of information. And if not, the IUCN website has a lot of information, so it depends kind of what you want specifically, but it's a good resource as well.
Awesome. Regina says, thank you very much. That was an amazing talk. I have a question regarding the water temperatures. You mentioned they dive to great depths in colder water and remain at the surface to feed. Have you noticed any change in feeding behavior with sea surface temperature rise in the last decades?
Very interesting question. So we've been trying to calculate metabolism of the whale sharks based on published literature on metabolism of sharks, for example. using temperature data. And the issue we find is that whale sharks spend a lot of time at the surface in Qatar, in the Arabian Gulf, where the temperatures normally exceed 35, 36 degrees Celsius in the summer. And the whale sharks there spend hours at the surface ram feeding on tuna spawn, tuna eggs. So this kind of throws everything out the window, because it's like, ooh, maybe they like more temperate waters, but they can clearly tolerate some of these extreme conditions. There's a very good paper by a friend of mine, David Robinson, 2017. And the title is Some Like It Hot. So if you Google Some Like It Hot whale sharks Qatar, it'll be the first one to pop up. And it also talks about some of these temperature, sustained extreme temperature of the whale sharks. In the Philippines, our deepest diver went to about 1,650 meters. It was around 10 degrees, the water, but it did a bounce dive. So what we're seeing is some of these steep dives, they're just like a very steep bounce dive. And this could be related to either thermoregulation, it could be a predatory avoidance. For example, think of a whale shark swimming at the surface, is hit by a boat. The first thing it's gonna do is dive as fast as it can, as deep as it can, potentially. And they've shown this behavior in other species, for example, like leatherback turtles. It is a predatory response. So we haven't, so there is one very good paper from Anna Sekira from 2014 that talks about climate change and how it impacts whale shark ecosystems. And for example, in the Pacific, they model no change in their distribution, but there is some contraction in habitat use for the Indo and Atlantic Oceans. So, but it was very small. It was something like 3 to 4 or 5%. So it wasn't something drastic that you're like, okay, half of their habitat is disappearing in 30 years. But I think we still need more information and data on what drives their prey. For example, a lot of the zoo and macroplankton is like what is driving those blooms that is kind of driving a lot of the big coastal aggregations, and how is that going to be impacted by climate change. And I think acidification might be a bigger player in that role, ocean acidification.
Well, Jose asks, thanks for the amazing talk, Gonzalo. I guess that whale sharks birth pups live. Where you found the whale shark pup in the Philippines, is it a hotspot for pregnant females, or are the hotspots made up of animals that are not pregnant?
Good question, Jose, thank you. So, for example, in the Galapagos of Darwin and Wolf, they see a lot of females, almost exclusively females, and they're all huge. And a lot of them are expected to be pregnant. The guys there haven't yet proven that they're pregnant. They're doing some ultrasounds with a team from Georgia Aquarium and a team from Okinawa in Japan. So they are actually trying to find where these pregnant females are. In the Philippines, in Don Sol, where we found the pup, we do have some large females. I want to say 10 to 11, 12 meters possibly. But the visibility there is so bad that we can't actually get a good estimate of size. That's why we started using the drone, because we can't actually see the whole whale shark underwater. So when you see a big whale shark coming towards you, you're like, well, I'm just seeing the head on the side. So I'll check to see if it's a female or a male, but you can't actually get a good view of the proportions. So for us to infer that they might be pregnant, you would have to have a pretty good look. And we haven't been able to do so, to be honest. But the fact that we have very large animals and we have found pups there, I think I'd be pretty sure some of the large females are coming there to feed and possibly giving birth while at it, or maybe coming there to pup and then opportunistically feeding. That's the connection we have yet to find out as well.
Really interesting. Enrique says, really nice talk. If we happen by chance to come across the whale shark while scuba diving, is there any special precautions we should take? It is not common for us to see whale sharks in the coast of Ecuador where I am, but there are some encounters.
I'd say like it'd be really good if you could get a photo of the left flank of the animal. So the guys working in Ecuador can actually see if he's coming, say, from the Galapagos or he's coming from Peru, where there are whale shark monitoring programs. So I would say just if he's coming along the reef and he's coming towards you, try and get out of the way. So one of the things we record when we're trying to understand whale shark behavior and impact of tourists is we have this category called road blocking. So if the whale shark is swimming in a straight line and you happen to be in that straight line path, if you cause the animal to change direction, you're blocking its path essentially. So you cause a small but sufficient energy or potential movement route. So I'd say if it's moving in a straight line, try and stay out of its way so you don't unnecessarily disturb it. You can swim on the sides and carry on the sides of the animal without having to make it change direction, for example.
Really great advice. Coral says, great talk. Do mother whale sharks take care of their pups after birth? I mean, out of the 300 pups, do we know how many make it to adulthood or sexual maturity, like what their survival rate is?
Very good question. So because we only know about the reproduction based on this one pregnant female that was caught like 25 years ago, it's actually very hard to answer, give a straight answer about some of this, but we can kind of get an understanding of what might be going on. So the pregnant female with 300 pups actually had 3 size classes inside her. So this led to the understanding that whale sharks likely have a sperm storage kind of system. So they can fertilize a few eggs at a time. So therefore, when the female gives birth, it can give them out in batches. And the fact that she would have 300 pups from potentially a single mating opportunity means that survivability is likely very small. And that's why they have such a big number of pups. If you think of other species like great whites, for example, that have only 1 pup, means they invest a lot of energy into a single pup, and therefore the likelihood of survival is much higher. If we think a whale shark is maturing at, say, 9 meters, and they're born at 60 centimeters, the likelihood is that it's gonna take a lot of whale sharks to make it to adulthood, essentially. So survival rate is likely very low for newly born pups. And sorry, they don't look after their young, so they just kind of drop them.
They just kind of leave them to go on their own, fend for themselves right from the beginning. It's a hard life. Awesome. So Natasha says, thanks for sharing your insights. How is the current public health crisis impacting your whale shark research and the communities that you collaborate with?
Thanks for the question, Tash. Massively, essentially, when the world started shutting down by mid-March, we had to shut all our projects. And I know a lot of people are struggling. Our projects on site are run by a kind of pay-to-volunteer model. So the volunteers that come and help us on the field actually cover the cost of those sites. So if we're not operating the site, because everyone had to go home and we shut them down, it means like the work is not going on. Our employees are still employed and everyone is still doing their work. A lot of computer time, mind you, so no field time at the moment. So essentially what we'll be missing is we'll be missing a season at some of these sites. And because we miss the season, we also miss that relationship with the locals. So it is impacting our work massively. And I know many of the whale shark work around the world is also in the same. Our friends at the Maldivian whale shark project, for example, they started a GoFundMe campaign because they didn't predict that all of a sudden there wouldn't be any people joining their team, so they don't have essentially any cash to run till the end of the year. So yeah, it's a difficult time for everyone.
Definitely is, really. So Gemma says, it's not a question, but she says, I find it crazy how there is such little information on whale shark reproduction and where this occurs with all the modern day research techniques and technologies that we have.
It's true. I mean, it is weirdly in the last kind of 2 decades, the whale sharks become one of the most studied species of sharks. So if you look at publications globally, there's a lot of work going on with whale sharks. It's just that the limitation in terms of their reproduction is the availability to these animals. So because there's very few sites where we see big, potentially pregnant or potentially mating animals, is very few of them. That's why we haven't found some of these answers, especially like pupping grounds, for example. Like it'd be very hard, even if you know a pregnant female is pregnant, you would put some sort of tracker on her and she would go into the middle of the Pacific and return to the same site, and you would infer that maybe that's where she gave birth, but we wouldn't necessarily be 100% sure that that's where she gave birth. So it is tricky. There are, for example, reports of mating behavior in San Helena in the South Atlantic. So you're thinking two large whale sharks are kind of getting rowdy. It would cause and create people to pay attention. In Donsol, it's the same. Some of the guys that have been doing the whale shark tours for almost 2 decades now, or over 2 decades actually, they've reported behavior that sounds like potential mating. So it is maybe possible that whale sharks maybe mate when they're in the same place, mature adults, mature males and females, but because it's not been properly documented, we don't actually know.
I find that for me, it's really interesting. I think not just with whale sharks, but with many marine species, that like a lot of things you would think we would know the answers to or might have, because it seems like such a simple idea or something like that. We really don't. There's just so much research that still needs to be done and still, you know, needs to be worked on and everything like that, and finding the people to actually do that and keep pushing forward research and keep learning more and more about all these animals.
Totally. So, I mean, the reason why we want to find some of these questions is, for example, where they pup or where they mate, we would consider these areas like critical habitats for the species. And therefore, if you were planning the recovery of the species, these are the sites that need to be protected first. And then you have these other, for example, these large hotspots of whale sharks, like off the eastern coast of Mexico, in the Yucatan Peninsula, like the largest aggregation globally. I think Rafa documented from an airplane something like over 1,000 animals in a relatively small area. Same in Qatar, these animals aggregate offshore, and it's like hundreds of whale sharks, and you can see them at the surface. So if you had limited resources and limited intervention that you could execute, you would focus in on these very kind of important areas for the species.
Very true. So Victoria asks a couple questions. So she says, thank you for the information. First question, she asks, are they mostly solitarily, or do they only hang out when they mate?
Good question. So whale sharks are mostly solitary. We have some underwater footage of groups of whale sharks moving together. I think we have a maximum of 23 individual animals that seem to be just swimming through the water column, like a school of fish. But that's extremely rare. Like normally when you do find them aggregating, it tends to be a feeding aggregation. So because we haven't seen them mate, we don't actually know where they mate or if they might aggregate in numbers or whatever. When we do see them in numbers, they tend to be feeding.
Mm-hmm. And do they migrate a lot to find food, or do they stick around the same spot, do you think?
Good question. So there's some evidence from different parts of the world. They can be like quite residential to an area. For example, the whale sharks in Mafia Island in Tanzania, they have some individuals that seem to be hanging around year round with some excursions of say a week or 2 weeks, but always spending time within the foraging site in Tanzania. In other sites like the Philippines, we have very short seasons in some of the spots, say 2 to 3 months. And then the whale sharks that we have the tracks to show this, they actually do some pretty long distance movements. And what tends to happen is in the tropics, these zooplankton blooms are very patchily distributed. So they happen here and here and there. So the whale sharks have to be very good to predict or have assimilated that behavior from a previous foraging opportunity, that's where food might be at that specific time of the year. And they go and they spend time there. When that food source is depleted, or perhaps the foraging opportunity is limited, they move on to the next one. But in some areas where productivity is high, it might be sustained as such, or blooms of different prey over the course of a few months, for example. So it depends on the site mostly.
All right, and then just one more question. It says, have you ever seen or read about whale sharks hanging out with other whales or other species?
I mean, the range does overlap. A very good example is Ningaloo Reef in Western Australia. You have the migration of the humpback whales along the coastline. They go all the way up to the Kimberley and then go feeding down to Antarctica. And the whale sharks use most of the reef. So there's some new evidence coming out that the whale sharks actually go as far down as Perth towards the warmer years, towards the warmer months. So there is an overlap of habitat. We have had interactions with multiple species feeding together of whale sharks, manta, mobile rays, and some baleen whales. This is super rare, though, for us at least. But it does happen. But what was interesting was whenever we saw the whales associated with the mobile rays, we didn't see whale sharks or vice versa. So if we saw the whale, we saw no whale sharks. If we saw the whale sharks, we never found the whale. So it could be that some of these animals are avoiding each other. I have seen drone footage from Australia where there is a humpback whale swimming up the coast, and there was a whale shark heading like almost if they were going to crash, if you will. And the whale shark literally does a 90-degree turn and heads to deeper water. So could be coincidental, or it could be that they try and avoid some of these animals. We don't know. But there is definitely overlap in Baja California as well. You have overlap of whale sharks with some of the whales. So yeah.
I've seen similar areas like overlap with whale sharks and humpbacks here, as well as sometimes the mabulas. But one of the weirdest ones I've seen was actually this year in February. We were in the whale shark area in La Paz, and early in the morning, and there was a pod of bottlenose dolphins that were also in the area, and it was like I'll call it playing, but it looked more like they were just harassing a juvenile whale shark. They were basically chasing him around and jumping out of the water over the top and like back and forth, and they'd come underneath it, and like it looked like they were trying to use the whale shark as a game, and the whale shark was not very happy about it. But you know,
it sounds like dolphins, to be honest.
Yeah, exactly.
There is I saw the data is not published, unfortunately, but our friends in Indonesia on southeastern Borneo, they have some whale sharks that hang around these fish catching platforms essentially, and they have maybe 2 groups of killer whales that pass by every year, and when the killer whales are seen in the area, the whale sharks disappear. So that's also quite interesting.
Really interesting. All right, so thank you, Victoria, for those questions. Let's go to Carlos. Carlos asks, are there any spots in the South Atlantic Ocean where you see whale sharks?
So they go as far south as northern Santa Catarina in eastern Brazil, and off the coast of Central Africa. I want to say, yeah, not South Atlantic. No, the water is too cool. But they do pass through South Africa as well. So it depends on the year where the warmer currents come up or not. But it's not common, not down there.
All right. Kristen asks, she says, hey everyone, and thank you, Gonzo, for your awesome talk. Are you also doing research on whale shark behavior, or do you have any ideas on how to conduct this research or any ideas to conduct this research in the future?
So we have published a few papers on whale shark behavior, and we have some others on review at the moment. The way we normally do it is we do what is called a focal follow. So we have a slate for underwater, and we record the behavior of the whale shark every, say, a minute, or every time something happens. We call these events, and then we record the reaction of the whale shark, and we also record other bits of information like the size, the sex, if the animal is scarred, for example, if it's been seen in that site many times, if it's swum with tourists many times. So these are some of the things you can put together, and there is enough literature for you to create an ethogram that is essentially a table of possible whale shark behaviors, and then you can try and record those underwater and how the animal might be behaving or reacting to specific things.
All right. So Ruby asks, have you ever seen a baby whale shark?
So unfortunately not. The one that happened in the Philippines last month, I was doing some work in Malaysia at the time. So unfortunately, I didn't get to see it. And it was only our project leader on that site that was still in the area. Oh, actually, no, I think a couple of our volunteers were also there. So they got really lucky because this is very rare, very lucky people.
Amazing right there. That's an incredible experience to see. Awesome. So Deanira asks, are whale sharks segregated by age for part of their lives? Do you see whale sharks are of different sizes in the feeding concentrations? She says, where I live in south the Pacific side of Costa Rica, we see sometimes juveniles of around 5 to 6 meters, but never anything larger than that.
That's a very good question. So most of the coastal aggregations we see globally, so across most sites, whale sharks would be between 4 and 6.5, maybe 7 meters. That's like kind of your average range in these coastal areas. Some other places are a bit of an exception, like Don Sol, there is a high recurrence of big animals. Galapagos, for example, they're mostly like large females. So there is segregation. So another interesting fact is that we don't know where juvenile females are. So most of these sites globally, between 4 and 6 meters, most of them are male, like 70, 80, even 90+% male. For example, in the Philippines alone, from Don Sol to the Central Islands to the southern part of the country, we actually see size and sex segregation as well. So as we move south, we have a higher percentage of males, and the average size of the animals gets smaller, like significantly.
That's really interesting. Then here too, like in Baja, like depending which area we're going or where we see them, whether it be, you know, in the south by Los Cabos offshore, like Gordo or something like that, or,
Sure.
you know, in La Paz or Bahia de Los Angeles, these different areas where we spot them, or out in Socorro and Noravia, you tend to always see, it's very rare that I've seen like large variations in size in the same area. It's really interesting.
I know, for example, some years ago, I was lucky to go out on survey with the research team in Qatar, led by David Robinson and Stefan Bach. And we were, I think, about 80 kilometers offshore, and there was maybe 150 whale sharks feeding on the surface, like you could see them. And what David was telling me there was like, it looked like the smaller animals were outside the feeding group, and the larger individuals with some adults, like there were some very big whale sharks there, they were sticking to the center of this feeding group. Because imagine that many whale sharks on the surface is like quite a spectacle. And the whole thing is turning and moving, and it's going with the currents where the aggregation of that fish spawn is at its highest. So it was very interesting to see that you could stay in one spot in the water, and the whale sharks would like start passing by you. And it's true that as you got towards the outside of the group, the animals would be smaller. So quite interesting as well.
That's really interesting. Wow, that must have been incredible to see.
Very lucky.
Well, exactly, really lucky. Making me want to go to Qatar now. So we're getting tight on time, guys. So we're gonna take one more question, and then what we can do is any other questions or anything like that, we can post it onto the Dive Ninjas Instagram or Facebook to the posts about Gonzo, or you can hit them up on social media or contact through Lamave, and we'll get those questions answered for you. So last one we got, Robert asks, great talk. You're seriously a brilliant scientist. What do you think the future of whale shark conservation holds, and what do you think your role will be in it?
Wow, quite a deep question.
Gotta end with a good one.
I think what we're seeing in the short term is putting together all the whale shark tracking data from all over the world. So this would be like hundreds and hundreds of satellite tracks from the different sites, and we're gonna overlay them and look at shipping traffic. So this is being led by David Sims from here in the UK. The Global Shark Movement is called, and the idea for that is to try and address the vessel collision issue, which after targeted take we think is one of the largest threats to the species, because we can quantify that mortality from the large vessel collisions. So I think that's going to be quite interesting, see what it finds and see if you can potentially move certain fishing routes, for example, boat routes, the big container ships and so on. So I think that's the more imminent one we can look at. And then for whale shark targeted take, I think it'd be very interesting to start looking into where those fisheries that were operating legally and openly in the Indo-Pacific, where might they have shifted now that the eye was put on those spots. For example, those fisheries in the southeast of China, they were targeted by media productions, they were exposed, if you will. All of a sudden it's like, oh shit, like we shouldn't do this anymore, or we go to a warehouse in the next province and the animals are being processed there. So I think for the targeted take, I think that's a pretty important thing to look into. So maybe after this COVID thing passes over, we can start looking at this a bit more detail. And for me, I don't know, I'm really interested to see like a bigger picture kind of whale shark understanding. For example, we're working with colleagues in all of East and Southeast Asia to try and put together all the whale shark data we have. And this is spanning multiple countries. It's spanning even from Australia all the way up to Japan. So this is quite an interesting group of whale shark populations. And it's like, are they mixed together? Can we look at their genetics in more detail? Can we actually see where they might be moving? If all the juveniles are in the center of the tropics, if they're all being like the very young juveniles are kind of hanging out there, and then kind of expanding and moving to these other areas where we see bigger whale sharks. And I think the technology is getting there, or is there already. So we should make the most of it. So I think that's hopefully what I'll be working on in the near future.
That's awesome. Really, really great. Well, thank you for this. It's been an incredible talk. Tons of questions. We still have more to go even. So, but thank you for taking time to speak with us today and everything like that. And I hope to see you really soon when we can get out there, hopefully in January, to get out there and see the Philippines with you and get to see you guys work and research and everything like that. So thank you for joining us today, Gonzo.
Thank you so much, Jay. Anytime.
Awesome. Well, guys, thank you for everybody tuning in today. Remember, check out the trip that we were talking about. And also, there's a lot of cool online courses Dive Ninjas is running right now. They've got a Project Aware this week, coral conservation, all sorts of cool stuff, equipment and all these kind of things that you can do online while you're stuck at home. Check them out on the Dive Ninjas website. Tomorrow we're off. We take a day to relax and everything. And Monday we're back here with Annie Cardosa, who will be teaching us a little bit about zero waste philosophy and how it can help benefit the oceans and everything like that. So we'll hope to see you guys on Monday. We'll be there. And then we kick off our macro week shortly after that. So have a wonderful weekend. Gonzo, thank you so much for joining us. Great to see you, brother. And we'll see you soon. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe out there. Take care.
Thanks so much. You too. Ciao, ciao.